the fun of live classes. Welcome to our tour of Italy, everyone. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right, so we kind of looked at the philosophy. We get that. We know higher acid, more cool climate wines in the north sort of follow, not necessarily always fuller bodied, but more bombastic, softer wines in the south, and a lot of food in between. And what's important about the food in Italy? Everything. Wine is food. It belongs on the table. It goes with food. Most of the time, if you don't like an Italian wine, it's probably because you're not having it with food. And in Italy, if somebody's had, too much to drink, they don't necessarily say that he's drunk. They say that they haven't had enough to eat yet. So the culture around the table and food and wine is very important here. The Greeks were immensely important in Italy. They named it Inotria, or land of the vine. They brought a lot of grape varieties that we still think today are used in Italy that we can trace back to the Greeks. There's more Greek ruins in Italy today than there are in Greece. But the Romans came along as well, and the Romans made a lot of advancements on a lot of the winemaking and grape growing techniques that the Greeks had brought. The Romans really understood the idea of terroir, matching specific grape varieties to specific soil types and climate so that they would perform better. They, used oak and wood. They tightly sealed their wine so they would be protected from air. They learned more about macerating grapes and achieving better red color and things like that. After the fall of the Roman Empire, we see a decline in winemaking, and this was especially important in Italy during this decline. And we kind of go into the Middle and the Dark Ages. And when we begin to see the Italian Renaissance, which starts in Tuscany, coming after kind of like the plague or the Black Death during the Middle Ages of Europe, we see a huge shift in the wine production. Wine production becomes important again at the beginning of the Renaissance. And really what the Renaissance did was it changed the caste system of this peninsula. Prior to the Middle Ages, really, if your father was a shoemaker, you would be a shoemaker, right? The profession that your family was in was usually the profession that you would become in. After 30 to 50% of the population of Europe perished during the Black Death, this changed the system, right? It brought a lot more social mobility to Europe, and especially to this area on the peninsula. And this is when we really begin to see a lot of people seeking out arts, literature, philosophy, painting. And with all of this boom in social mobility, we see a boom in wine production too. And a lot of this Renaissance was kind of based, again, on the culture of the Greeks as well. So let's fast forward a little bit now. We're post the Renaissance. Tuscany has been very important. We're still carrying on a lot of the traditions of both the Greeks and the Romans as we move forward. In 1815, the process of Risorgimento began. And this is when we are attempting to unify these different areas of Italy into one state. So this happens in 1861. Garibaldi unifies Italy. Most importantly, he gives the peninsula of Italy a single language, even though we still have a lot of different dialects. And we begin to see wine production really pick up steam in the modern era. It was pretty hurt by World War I and World War II. A lot of kind of fascist policies that were in place in Italy as well. But after World War II, we begin to see a kind of a boom in production again. And this is when we begin to establish Italian wine law. And this is important because one of the most difficult things about a bottle of Italian wine is figuring out what it says. Who is the producer? What is the grape variety? Where is it coming from? And what the heck does all of the other things other than the grape, the producer, where it's coming from on the label mean? So in 1963, we introduced this system. I'm going to talk about that in a second. It was unwieldy. It became too lenient, and they attempted a reform in 1992. And this is really was informed by the growth of super Tuscan. We see a big increase in these DOCs and DOCGs. I'm going to explain this better in 1 second. In 2008 to 2011. And today, Italy is the largest exporter of wine to the US. Now in Italy, they make wine everywhere. If we were to look at a wine map of France, you would notice that where we're growing grapes is very specific, right? It's not like this map of Italy we just looked at. You're like, wow, if you look at this, it's like wine grapes are like the Italian version of the American front lawn, right? If there's space there, you're going to plant grapes and you're going to grow them. And it is true, we really have a great climate in most of Italy for this production. So, wine law. I'm going to go through this fast because I don't want to bore you, even though I think this is one of the most interesting parts of learning about wine. Because understanding wine law tells us about what's in the bottle, the nomenclature, the information on the label that tells the consumer what they can expect about how the wine will taste and feel structurally on your palate, and also why it costs what it costs. We're going to talk about that. So the top tier of Italian wine quality is known as the DOCG. They're telling you that the wine in the bottle is controlled and guaranteed. So you can see the DOCG banner here that you'll find on a bottle of these wines. There's currently 75 DOCGs within Italy. So this is like your top tier of Italian wine. Like these should be your benchmarks, the best of the best. They should be the most expensive because you're assuming that the quality of the best is better than the worst. And then we also have a tier down, the DOC. So also a very well-regarded category, 408 DOCs in Italy. So we have a lot more. I don't know of anybody who can name all 408 DOCs. I don't even know if a master sommelier or a master of wine could do that. Maybe there's somebody that can, but a lot of them are not really as important in, I guess, maybe the US market. And we don't maybe see them exported as much outside of the country, especially as we get into the south of Italy. So we have these two categories, right? And at the top tier, you can see it's the most restrictive. The DOCG is the thing that says, if you call your wine Brunello di Montalcino, this is the grape you have to use. This is how long you have to age your wine. And this is the area that it actually has to come from. It can also cover rules and regulations, like how you actually grow your grapes and pick them as well. Again, making sure that the quality is of the top level. Next, we have the DOC, just below that, as we were mentioning. And below that, in 1992, we mentioned that Gloria's law, we have the IGT. So we mentioned that the DOCG and the DOC covers what grape variety you have to use. It covers where you have to actually grow those grapes to call it by that appellation name. Let's say Verdicchio di Castelli di Jesi, which is a DOC, right? It has to be Verdicchio. It can't be anything else. Now, the IGT law came about because of Super Tuscan. And Super Tuscans were wines that were being made in Tuscany, but they weren't following the laws of the regions like Brunello di Montalcino or like Chianti or Chianti Classico. So those producers had to declassify those wines. And prior to 1992, they had to declassify them to the lowest level, which was just wine. And wine has no geographical indication, so you couldn't say anything about where the grapes came from in Italy. Now, these Super Tuscans, because of their quality and their popularity, became some of the most expensive wines in Italy. So in 1992, they created the IGT category, and this allowed you to put a more relaxed area of production on your label, corresponding with one of those 20 autonomous regions that we saw. So the most common that you would see for Super Tuscan would be Tuscany, a larger area that the grapes can come from, and then more relaxed regulations about which grape varieties you can use and how you can make your wine. So I hope that makes sense. Now, you also see three other terms that tend to be really confusing on a bottle of Italian wine: Classico, Riserva, Superiore. You might see all three of these on a single label of wine at one time. Classico essentially means that it's a smaller area of production within a DOC or DOCG. So now in Italy, over time, some of these boundaries have been expanded. And Chianti and Chianti Classico is a great example of that. The Chianti Classico area is the original heartland for the Chianti region. Over time, the boundaries were expanded, usually for political reasons, right? Somebody petitioning, they're right outside the boundary, they're saying, but wait, I make wine from Sangiovese the same way Chianti Classico does. I should be allowed term, and those boundaries have been widened. So because of that, we have this Classico area. When you see Classico on a label, it's usually telling you that it should be, again, a higher quality area, a smaller boundary of geographical production that the grapes come from, again, guaranteed quality as well. You also might see Reserva. Reserva means the wine has been aged for longer. Why does this matter? Because aging wine in the bottle changes the flavor and it changes the experience that you have with the wine. Young wine has more fruit. It has a fresher fruit taste to it. When you age wine in barrel or in the bottle, you lose some of that fresh fruit, right? The fruit becomes a little bit more dried, what we call more tertiary flavors and aromas. That kind of like sometimes a little bit more like mushroom, sometimes that leather characteristic. In Italy, it's really common to develop sort of a balsamic characteristic that you might get to these particular wines as well. So Reserva in each region is telling you the wine's been aged longer. And again, each appellation or DOC or DOCG has its own set of rules around how long it has to be aged to call it Reserva. We'll talk about that with the individual regions. Now you might also see Superiore. This can be a little bit more confusing, but generally it means that there is more alcohol in the wine. Why is this also an indication of higher quality? Because usually you see Superiore on a bottle of wine, maybe in a really good year or a good vintage, where those grapes achieve extra ripeness. When you might have a little bit more ripeness, your wines also might be Reserva. You might be able to age them for longer. It also means that you have a little bit more of those intense fruit flavors because of the ripening of those grapes. I say this all the time, so many of you have heard it if you've taken my classes, but when you think about the ripeness of fruit in wine, think about ripeness in fruit in general. And I always like to use a peach as the best comparison. Think about a peach in June. Maybe it's not quite ripe yet. It's a little bit firm, doesn't have, as much juicy flavor as a peach that you get in August, where you have to actually eat it over the sink because it's so juicy, and you think about how much more concentrated the flavor of that fruit is. How are we doing so far, guys? Checking in. All right, cool. People are chatting. I love that. Fantastic. So we're going to be kind of general and broad with these areas because we have 1 hour to talk about all of Italy. And I really think it's important to, before we dive into these individual regions, to lay a foundation, right? So that's why we talk about the history. That's why we talk about the wine law and how it affects what you find within those bottles. So we're going to start in the north, an area in the northeast known as the Trevenese. The Trevenese produces a lot of wine, really because of the region of the Veneto. And I see that a lot of you are chatting about having been to Italy, where you went, these bike rides. Kristen, I saw something at the beginning about taking a bicycle trip, and I don't remember where I saw that you went, but wherever you went, if it wasn't in the Veneto, I would imagine it was pretty mountainous and pretty hilly. So when we think of Italy in the north, we're surrounded by the Alps. And then we have the Apennines, which are a spine or a mountain chain that kind of run down the center of Italy as well. So really one of the major flat areas that's not at least hilly, if not mountainous, is this Veneto. This kind of plain that stretches out around the Po River as it goes out and empties into the sea. So because of that, because of these larger tracts of land, we see a lot of production within this area. What is a lot of that production? Pinot Grigio, of course. The Pinot Grigio from the Veneto tastes different than Pinot Grigio from Friuli. It does, because here in Friuli, the grapes have lower yield, meaning you get fewer grapes from each vine. And because you get fewer grapes, typically those grapes should be a little bit more concentrated in their flavor and their intensity, right? If you've ever had a Pinot Grigio, you're like, wow, this just kind of tastes like water. It was probably coming from a pretty high yielding area. And this Pinot Grigio is going to be less expensive than something you might get in Trentino Alto Adige, up here in the north, bordering Germany and Austria, where you see a lot of that influence in these wines. So in Trentino Alto Adige, you see a lot of the German grape varieties that you might become familiar with. You have Riesling in this area. You have grapes like Gewürztraminer. You have Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc. This is in the Alps. You can go skiing here. You can think about these wines as being high acid and incredibly crisp. And if you are having a glass of wine, you know, in between runs down the slope, this might be the perfect thing to quench your thirst during this time, right? You also see some great wines in Trentino Alto Adige coming from red grapes. You might see something called Schiava. Tends to be, people say, kind of like fruity and almost in a candy cotton-esque flavor, not in a sweet way, but in the intensity of that fruit way. You also see a red grape in the area known as Lagrein. Lagrein can be a little bit on the kind of meatier and weightier side for the red grape coming from Trentino Alto Adige. Friuli, we mentioned as well. Over here, we talk about a lot of white wine coming from this area. Many of them are blends. And we have two distinct styles for whites. We do have, again, these sort of crisp, stainless steel produced wines. Stainless steel will retain more fruit in a white wine than, say, something like oak. And you also have the sort of antithesis of that, what we call orange wine. And orange wines are coming from white grapes that are macerated or fermented with the skin. So they do gain a little bit of color and a little bit of, aside from the color, a little bit of texture and tannin from the skins of the grape. Think about when you drink iced tea, and it's not as tannic as if like maybe you were drinking a cup of like really dark black tea and you hadn't added any milk or cream yet, but you still get a little bit of that texture on the palate, right? Orange wines can be similar. A lot of them are often made in a more natural style as well, maybe native yeast or unfined or unfiltered, so they still have a little bit of cloudiness to them. You do see some red grapes in Friuli. Merlot is actually the most planted red, but you also see native grapes. They're called Schioppettino. Who's a Syrah fan? Whoever likes that intense peppery characteristic that you get from Syrah or Shiraz, you will also like Schioppettino. It is one of the grapes that has the most rotundin, which is what gives wines that kind of peppery characteristic to them. You also see a native red grape in the area known as Refosco. Now, as we're moving back down to the Veneto, we kind of started here. We're talking about Venice. We're talking about the city of Verona, of course. Many of us have been to Verona if you've been to this particular area of Italy. And there are a couple of wine regions, DOCGs and DOCs, that sort of spread out in the hills to the north of Verona. The most important of these, of which, of course, are Soave. Soave is a white wine region based on a grape known as Garganega. And then you also have the red wine regions of Bardolino and Valpolicella. So most of us are familiar with Amarone della Valpolicella, which is a pretty rich, luscious style of red wine. Not all of the red wines coming from Valpolicella have to be made like Amarone. These grapes are actually picked and then dried in sort of almost like attics, right? These kind of warm areas that raisinate the grapes before we actually make wine out of them. What happens when you raisinate a grape? Think of a grape and a raisin. And the raisin, you have, again, more concentrated fruit flavors and more sugar, right? Because as you've lost the actual water in that grape, the sugar itself has concentrated. So when you make wine from the grape that is raisined, you get a concentrated wine. And sometimes Amarone or Recioto della Amarone has a little bit of that sweetness to it as well. They're usually pretty high alcohol too. We're talking like 15.5%. If you're only having one bottle with dinner and you want to make it count, you're probably thinking about Amarone. Because that process of drying the grapes and then aging the wine takes longer, the wine costs more. If it takes the producer longer, they need to hold on to the wine longer. If it costs them more money before they can release it, that cost always gets passed on to the consumer in the end as well. All right, moving to Central. Oh, I didn't talk about Prosecco. Sorry, Prosecco also coming from the Veneto as well. All Prosecco comes from a grape called Glera. Prosecco is typically not made in the same method as something like Champagne or Cava, where Champagne or Cava go through a second fermentation in the bottle, and that second fermentation has to have yeast. That's how we ferment sugar. Yeast sugar ferments it into alcohol, and that yeast is what gives Champagne and Cava a little bit more of that toasty, bready characteristic. In Prosecco, there's no law saying you have to ferment the wine in the bottle like we do with Champagne or Cava. So because of that, Prosecco usually retains a little bit more of the fresh fruit and floral characteristic of the Glera grape, and not as much of that sort of like toasty brioche flavor, right? That's why, again, Prosecco is usually less expensive unless it's coming from Conegliano or Valdobbiadene, which are two crus that can be quite expensive for Prosecco within the region. And that's why we love it for brunch, right? It's fresh, it's usually fizzy, it's low alcohol. Prosecco, kind of your entry-level Prosecco usually has a little bit more sugar and sweetness to it than we find in something like Champagne or Cava. Now moving back into the central area of Italy as well, we're going to talk about three regions. Campania, the Marche, which we're drinking a wine from today, if you have wine from Cortez, and Abruzzo. Out of all of these regions, you are more likely, I think, to see wines coming from Abruzzo. People are really familiar with Montepulciano, Abruzzo, the grape variety, coming from the region, this little pink area on the Adriatic Sea. So we're just east of Rome. We have Rome is here in Lazio, an area where most of the wine that's made in Lazio is consumed locally, right? We drink it in the trattorias in Rome. It's kind of your inexpensive wine that you see if you go to an Italian trattoria and you order a white or a red, you're getting something from Lazio, from that region. And that's actually common in a lot of these areas within Italy. It's you're probably, if you go to a restaurant, you order the white or the red that's kind of classic for that restaurant, it's usually something from that region. And it makes sense when we think about if we're eating food in a restaurant that's probably from this particular autonomous region, the wines have evolved over time with that cuisine. So it really makes sense that these two things go together, right? We like to say what grows together goes together. And Italians like to eat, and that's why I said too that Italian wines typically do need food. So I started with Abruzzo, so I don't want to get too far off of that, and then we'll kind of work our way from the bottom up here. So we're in the region of Abruzzo. The most important grape is Montepulciano. Montepulciano tends to create a fresh and pretty fruity wine, but it also can be a little bit earthy and meaty. And when I say earthy and meaty, not in that tertiary bottle aged way, but it can have a little bit of funk to it. And if you're a fan of Montepulciano, you probably know what I mean. It has a little bit of this sort of, it's one of the grapes that sometimes actually tastes a little bit like grape juice to me. Entirely like grape juice? Of course not, because fermentation, changing grape juice into alcohol, adds and changes those flavors. But you get a little bit of grapiness to this. It doesn't usually tend to be a very tannic red wine. As far as red wine come from Italy, it usually can be a little bit fresher. One of the wines in Italy that I think you can oftentimes drink on its own. You don't need to have a meal with it or have food with it to soften Montepulciano. It's already soft on its own. As we move north, we're in an area known as the Marche. So we talk primarily about red wine in Abruzzo. They do have a white based on the Trebbiano grape, one of the most planted grapes within Italy altogether. But in Marche, we're really talking about white wine, and we're primarily talking about this grape called Verdicchio. We're going to talk about this in a little bit as well, but Verdicchio is a really cool grape. I think if you like any type of crisp wine, if you like Vermentino coming from the Ligurian coast, if you like Sauvignon Blanc coming from somewhere like Sancerre, if you like crisp Riesling or Pinot Grigio, you would also enjoy the wines coming from this region. They are coastal. You see a lot of that influence of the sea. These are wines that are fantastic to go with seafood, of course. You have fish, you have oysters, you have clams, you have octopus. All of these things would be really fantastic with these styles of wine. Castelli di Jesi is closer to the coast, so it tends to take on a little bit of that more kind of sun-kissed, slightly rounder characteristic to it, with a little bit of kind of saltiness. And then Verdicchio di Matalica Reserva is a little bit further inland. Because of that higher altitude, you get a little bit sharper acidity in these particular wines. Now, Campania, we're moving a little bit further south, is a really, really cool region. We're really in the south here, right? We kind of get this, what we call this the veal line, we call this the butter line, we call this the sometimes the poverty line in Italy. It's this area kind of, once you get to Rome, in the south, Italy becomes much more rural. It's more it's economically poorer. It really is. It has higher rates of unemployment. And we see a lot less of the wines being exported to places like the US as well. Now, it's a little bit different when we get to Sicily. They have the port of Palermo, so a really easy port. But if you're a producer and you're in Puglia or Basilicata or Calabria, because of the infrastructure in this part of the country, which is quite a bit poorer, it's much more difficult to get your wine to, let's say, Palermo, or up here to somewhere around Pisa, to get your wines out onto a container ship for export, right? So a lot of the wines in the South really tend to be consumed domestically. This is the type of place that you grab your flask and you go down to your neighbors, or whichever one of your neighbors makes your favorite type of wine. You fill it up for however many euros they charge, and you take that home. And you kind of have that cask of wine or that growler of wine at home to drink. Now, Campania itself, though, is the area surrounding Naples. So we do have more infrastructure in this area. We have Mount Vesuvius. We know about these incredible Roman ruins within the area. And Mount Vesuvius is an active volcano. Actually, Naples is one of the most dangerous cities to live in the world because of this active volcano. If it does go, all of Naples is pretty much right in the danger zone. Yes. It hasn't had a very serious eruption, I don't think, since the 1960s. It does sometimes have a little bit of ash, but what this ash does is it actually helps replenish the soils in this area. And this is fantastic. The grapes, even grapes prefer nutrient for soil to grow, but it also replenishes these soils for a lot of agriculture. Think about, if you think about Napoli, you think about Naples, if you think about your kind of classic Italian food that you think of in America, a lot of them come from this region. When you go to the store and somebody tells you, oh, make sure you get the San Marzano tomatoes, those are coming from the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. So it's agriculturally a very important area. We have some fantastic white wine. You have Greco di Tufo. It tends to be a lighter, fresher style of wine coming from Campania, a little bit more floral. It's a grape that was thought to be an ancestor or a grape that survived since the Greeks brought it here as well. We have Fiano di Avellino. Fiano di Avellino tends to produce a style of Italian white wine that's richer and more textured. And sometimes we say that it's kind of honeyed. And I don't want you to think that that means that the wine is sweet or thick, because it's not. But it produces these flavors that tend to be a little bit more resinous. And you might understand what I'm saying when you think about the idea that a lot of Italian white wines are not always about fruit. Like if we think about other white grapes coming from places in the world, Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, Chardonnay, some of the top, Albarino, a lot of these wines are fruity, right? And Italian wines don't always encompass that. A lot of them are about a little bit more of these savory characteristics that we might see in wine. For red wine, we're talking about Aglianico. There's hundreds, I mean, I think there's up to 350 grapes that are not authorized, but either authorized or recognized within Italy, but the real number is thought to be closer to 1,000 different grapes. And we really talk about three like really important red grapes. We have Nebbiolo in the north, which we'll discuss. We have Sangiovese in the center in Tuscany, which we'll discuss. And in the south, we have Aglianico. And I like to kind of think of Aglianico sometimes as sort of a stand-in for Cabernet Sauvignon. When I have a guest that says, I want to try something new, I usually drink Cab. I'm like, have you ever had a wine from Tarazi? Or have you ever had a wine from Voltura in Basilicata, made from the Aglianico grape? It has a lot of that darker fruit flavor that you tend to get in Cabernet. And it also has a lot of that acidity and tannin. So you get structurally a very firm wine on the palate that feels a lot fuller. So these can be really fantastic wines coming from the area of Tarazi, the DOCG, located in Campania here. Some other great things, you see Falanghino coming from Campania. A lot of vacationing can be done on Capri and Ischia are right here on the coast. You might see Falanghina coming from Campi Flegrei, kind of means like lava fields, an area that was initially named by the Romans as well for these very volcanic soils that they have. Right, we're doing good on time. So, you know, I'm really trying to make sure that we hit these areas and I give you just enough information without giving you too much, because I tend to get really excited and then take the class over the time that it should be. So just a little pat on the back, but I'm keeping you guys on track. So we're moving into southern Italy. Let's talk about Sicily, the most important Italian island. There's more than you probably think that produce wine. Sicily and Sardinia are the kind of the powerhouses for Italian wine islands, but you have Pantelleria, which is a satellite island of Sicily, a little bit closer, actually closer to, it's closer to Africa. It's right next to, I'm forgetting where it's next to, but it might come to me. And if it doesn't, it won't. We have Elba Island, which is off the coast of Tuscany, where Napoleon was exiled. We have the Lipari Islands here, do really fantastic things with white wines and Malvasia as well. And of course, we have Sicily. Sicily is an incredibly unique and interesting place. We mentioned before that the Mediterranean sort of means the middle of the earth, and really every culture that traveled around the Mediterranean Sea stopped in Sicily, and they left their mark on the culture here. It's also because of this warmer Mediterranean climate, it makes it very easy to grow grapes here. We don't have a lot of disease pressure like we see in places in France, Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Rhone Valley, the Loire. We can easily grow grapes here organically. We don't need to use a lot of pesticides or herbicides or fungicides. It's very easy to grow a lot of grapes. So we tend to have these high yields. In fact, even though the Veneto produces the most wine in Italy, right, because of that kind of larger flat tract of land, Sicily produces the second most wine in Italy, even though it's a much smaller area and is also quite mountainous. But any area that's not covered with, here again, we're talking about tomatoes, we're talking about herbs and vegetables and things like capers as well, that we don't grow these things, we're growing grapes and we're making wine. Now, we're talking about a Mediterranean climate. If you are familiar with how and where we grow grapes within the world, you probably know that grapes don't like it to be too hot, right? They don't like a tropical climate because it's too moist for the grape. The grape will rot on the vine. They'll get sort of diseases. They just don't like to be wet. Grapes don't like to be wet. They like to be dry. They have to be dry during the harvest. And if we're in a warm area, how do we mitigate some of that warmth? If it's too warm, the grape ripens quickly and we lose too much acidity. And if you've ever had a really inexpensive wine that doesn't have enough acidity to it because maybe the producer didn't really care, they just wanted to ripen the grape as much as they could to get a lot of really bombastic fruit flavors out of it, but they didn't check the acid level, and you feel that kind of thick and sort of chewy and dull wine on the palate. So how do we mitigate that in these warmer climates like Sicily? Well, it's right here on the screen. We plant at altitude, right? As we move up in altitude, we mitigate some of that warmth. And there's a lot of altitude in Sicily to move up to. Another way that we can mitigate that is by planting vineyards close to the coast, which is what you see here. So we're going to talk about Cerasuolo di Vittoria, and we're going to talk about Etna. These are really the two major quality wine regions on Sicily. They make wine everywhere. Just because these are kind of the DOCs and the DOCGs doesn't mean that they don't grow grapes everywhere and just label it as Sicilia, because they do. So you'll see that IGT is the entire island of Sicily, or Sicilia, which you'll see on the label itself. Marsala, unfortunately unpopular, because the wine can be really fantastic. In Italy, every region has a history and a tradition of sweet wine production. Sweet wines in Italy, and I'm talking about these really beautiful, luscious, but balanced after dinner wines. You don't want to have dessert. You don't want to open another full 750 milliliter bottle of wine. When you're having wine with one other person, or maybe it's more, and you've gone through all of your wine, but then you're like, gosh, I want something else, but I don't want to open another bottle. Have that, half bottle of sweet wine for after dinner. It's perfect. It's the perfect size. It leaves you with the perfect finish of the evening. And Marsala has become, unfortunately, unpopular. And unfortunately, the quality has suffered as well. If you do want to try a great Marsala, Marco di Bartoli and Dano Fugata are two producers that we definitely recommend here as well. The history of Marsala dates back for a long time. It was an English sailor who docked here in Sicily, and he did what any good sailor should do. He got off of his boat and he found a bar to get drunk in. He loved the wines that he was drinking. He wanted to ship them back to England, but he was worried that these wines wouldn't really make the journey. Very going by boat, very slow. It's a warm area. So he fortified the wine by adding brandy to it to make the wine stronger, right? Why do we fortify? Because fortification makes things stronger. So he fortified the wine, and this is really what created this fortified style of wine that is Marsala. But let's talk about the dry wine. So Etna is a fantastic place that's seeing an incredible resurgence in the American market, but also just, I think, around the world as well. Etna is also located on the slopes of an active volcano. It's erupted recently, I think at least twice so far this year. Most of the vines are planted sort of mid-slope. Many of them are not necessarily high enough up that they're affected by these lava flows and by these eruptions, but some of them actually are. So we make two main styles of wine here. The first is a red wine that we like to compare to Pinot Noir. If you like Pinot Noir, you will like red wine coming from Etna DOC or Mount Etna. They're made typically from a grape known as Nerello Mascalese. You might see a little bit of the second grape, Nerello Cappuccio, in that as well. Just like Mount Vesuvius, you have incredibly volcanic soils here that are constantly being replenished from the ash of these eruptions. And this gives the wine a sort of mineral intensity and a little bit of smokiness to the wines as well. We talked about Schioppettino, we talked about Syrah, that kind of peppery meatiness. You might get a little bit of the sort of smoky characteristic in the wine coming from Etna. They also make fantastic white wines from a grape called Caricante, which I think we have down here. Caricante, so if you see an Etna DOC white wine, that's coming from Caricante. And these also will tend to be very mineral driven. They'll have a lot of acidity to them, quite a bit of texture, a little bit of smokiness. And again, that proximity to the sea, you do tend to get a little salty characteristics in wines that are grown close to the ocean. Now we're moving a little bit further south. We come to the Sole DOCG on Sicily. And this is an area called Cerasuolo di Vittoria. Cerasuolo di Vittoria is always a blend of two grapes. Nero d'Avola is the dominant grape, and Frappato is the accessory grape variety. I'm going to talk to you in a second because we have a wine from this area about what you might enjoy from there. All right, so we have two regions left. We'll talk about these wines. We're in central Italy. I think when we think about Italy, we think about Tuscany, right? One of the first wines I think we come to recognize both by name in Italy and as well by the actual flavor and structure profile is Chianti. They make a lot of it. It's easy to find. It's accessible in terms of its price point, and it has a really incredibly long history dating back to 1716 is when they actually defined the zone of Chianti itself. So that original Chianti zone dating back to 1716 is what we consider to be Chianti Classico. Now, we already kind of talked about the idea of the downfall of Chianti and the rise of the Super Tuscan. As Chianti is this outlined purple area. And so you can see there's a lot of other things within there, right? The purple area, the solid purple, is Chianti Classico. So this is the original heartland. So if you buy a wine that's Chianti DOCG at the store, that means the grapes can come from anywhere within this outlined purple area, which you can see. So you could have some grapes coming from the north up here, some grapes coming from the south down here, and then even down over here. So this doesn't really give us a definable imprint of terroir. And when we begin to get into these smaller zones of production, like Chianti itself. Other areas that are really well known within this zone would also be Chianti Rufina, which is not, sorry, my cursor doesn't always work, which is not located in the Classico zone, but is a little bit here to the northeast as well. Higher altitude area. This is a really great place to look for wines and hot vintages within Chianti itself. Some of the other areas that you might see for the production of the grape that we use for Chianti, Chianti Classico, and Chianti Rufina, which is Sangiovese, are these two areas or DOCGs in the south. So the first we'll talk about is Brunello di Montalcino, 100% Sangiovese, the same grape variety that we're using for Chianti and Chianti Classico. And also over here, we have Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. We talked about Montepulciano before, but in this case, Montepulciano is actually a town and a zone of production focusing on the Sangiovese grape. So sometimes that can be confusing when you're starting to learn about Italian wine. Montepulciano d'Abruzzo is the Montepulciano grape coming from the town of d'Abruzzo. Vino Nobile di Montepulciano in Tuscany, the town of Montepulciano, the grape itself is Sangiovese. I really love Vino Nobile di Montepulciano because it's not as well known. It's a much smaller area of production. And I think that the wine can be a really fantastic alternative to Chianti Classico, and also to Brunello di Montalcino. So why are all these areas called something different if they're all based on the Sangiovese grape? It's because of sort of genetic and human intervention over centuries, right? Since at least 1716 that we've been growing this grape. It really does give the Sangiovese grapes coming from each of these areas a little bit of a distinct subtlety from one another. One of those other regions is in Brunello di Montalcino. The aging requirement is much longer. It's actually the longest in Italy, 5 years, that the wine has to be aged at the property before release. which one makes the wine more expensive, but also changes the tone of how the flavor of the fruit and those tertiary flavors in the wine will taste, right? So if you know you like the flavor of aged wine, you want to look for Reserva, you want to look for Brunello di Montalcino. These wines will be more expensive because aging the wines ends up costing us more money at the end. It's much cheaper for us to buy a wine when it's young, like what we can do in Napa Valley, where they're released a year after the harvest, right? Usually they spend about a year in oak and then they're released, and then age it ourselves, but that's not as much fun. One, if you're in New York City, you don't have a lot of space to age wine. You probably don't have a cellar or maybe an off-site place that you keep your wine either. Sangiovese is the most important, as we know. You also might see Vernaccia coming from the region of Vernaccia di San Gimignano. It's a medieval walled town, the only white DOCG that you find in Tuscany, overwhelmingly a red wine area. Now, those super Tuscans we talked about, this started in the 1960s, wine called Ceparello. If you've seen wines called La Pergola Torte, if you've seen wines called Sassicaia, you've seen wines called Sassicaia, sorry, just that my internet is unstable. I hope you guys are still there. If you see wines called Sassicaia or Tignanello, these are the super Tuscans that we're talking about. Producers that were within Chianti Classico or in Tuscany that didn't want to abide by the rules in order to put those terms on their label. So they started producing high quality wines, usually from grape varieties that would come from France. So we're talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, we're talking about Merlot, we're talking about Syrah, but that's not always the case. Sometimes producers wanted to make their Chianti Classico with 100% Sangiovese, which until recently was also not allowed. So they decided to declassify their wines, and these became these super Tuscans. A lot of super Tuscan wines are now made on the coast in an area known as Bolgheri. This is where you also find Sassicaia is made over here. And you also see Trebbiano, that white grape we talked about, kind of ubiquitous in Italy. You see it everywhere. And also Vermentino. Vermentino, much like Verdicchio, tends to be a very crisp, green, super fresh white grape that's great with seafood. Anytime or anywhere it's hot, you want to drink Vermentino or Verdicchio. So we're going to finish on Piedmont, the foot of the Alps. We're surrounded by the Apennines and the Alps here. We're on the border with France. We actually see a lot of similarities with Burgundy. If you like Pinot Noir coming from Burgundy, Nebbiolo coming from Barolo or Barbaresco or other areas within Piedmont, has a lot more structure. It's more tannic on the palate as well. But the classification systems that we're beginning to see in Barolo and Barbaresco, based on these sort of individual vineyards or plots of land within these appellations, kind of mirrors the idea of what we're seeing in Burgundy. Not exactly the same. We're talking about a different region, different country, and different grape variety, but there are some similarities here. So Nebbiolo is king in Piedmont. This is the grape that makes us the money. This is the grape that ages the longest. This is the grape that collectors seek to find and pay top dollar for. But it's not the only wine that comes from Piedmont. We have a couple of other red grapes that are also very important. And these are sort of the grapes that producers tend to drink in Piedmont themselves. So I saw some people talking about Barbera d'Asti and Barbera d'Alba. What's the difference, right? So Barbera d'Asti, it's Barbera coming from, which is the grape, coming from the area of Asti, surrounding the town of Asti, right? So you can see this kind of larger area, Barbera d'Asti. Usually producers that make Barbera d'Asti focus on the Barbera grape itself, and also will usually focus on Moscato production. This is also where we see the spumante sparkling or slightly sparkling frizzante styles of sweet wine coming from the Moscato grape in this area. If you're drinking Barbera d'Alba, it's coming from the commune of d'Alba. So we're talking about near Barolo and near Barbaresco. And the producers of Barbera in d'Alba or in Alba are usually more focused on Nebbiolo. So if you're like, I really want to get into Nebbiolo and I want to start tasting the classic producers of Barolo and Barbaresco, but you don't want to drop $50, $60, $200, $400 on these bottles of wine, they probably produce a Barbera that you can get for a fraction of the price that will give you a little bit of insight to the personality of that producer. So that's kind of the difference of these two regions. So in Asti, it's really at the forefront. And in, I don't want to say this in a bad way, but in Alba, it can be a little bit of kind of an afterthought to Nebbiolo, which is really the focus of the region. Barbera is the wine that everybody likes. Grandma drinks it, everyone drinks it, high acid. It has a lot of beautiful kind of mountain berry fruit characteristic to it. Dolcetto is a little bit more intense. Dolcetto ripens the earliest, so it gets picked first. And Dolcetto tends to have a lot more tannin to it. So if you like a little bit more structure on the palate, more of that kind of drying sensation, fuller bodied, you'd probably prefer the Dolcetto to the Barbera. Do they make white wine here? Of course they do. Like most of Italy, we are red wine focused in Piedmont, but you see Cortese, which is the grape of Gavi over here in the southeast, which is very popular, an area right by Gavi as well that's not on the map. It's called Colli Tortonesi, where you're seeing the Timorasso grape is becoming really popular. It drinks a little bit like Chenin Blanc, high acid and a lot of honey texture to it. Not sweet, but a little bit richer on the palate, right? Italian wines tend to build richness in their whites without the addition of oak. We talked about Moscato. You see Moscato d'Asti tends to be, a little bit sparkling on this end. And then you also see sparkling, fully sparkling styles of Moscato as well. Now, Barolo and Barbaresco. Barolo, they like to say, sometimes I don't like to repeat these things, but they like to say like Barolo is kind of the king. The aging is longer than Barbaresco. They're both 100% focused on the Nebbiolo grape, but Barolo does tend to create more tannic, austere, need to be aged longer before they can be drank styles of Nebbiolo. And Barbaresco, because it's slightly further north and has softer, more sandier soils, produces lighter styles of the same grape. If you really love Nebbiolo, and again, you're not looking to spend $400 on a bottle of the best Barolo producers, you should look to this area called Alto Langhe. So up here in the north, Gattinara, Alto Piemonte. Gattinara and Gemme are also Nebbiolo focused, an area known as Carema, which is more in the north over towards France, and the Val d'Aosta are also really cool areas to look to for the production of Nebbiolo wine. And I'm also going to send you a follow-up of everything we're talking about tonight. So if you're like thinking tomorrow, you're like, wow, I love Nebbiolo and I can't remember that area called Carema that Amber was talking about last night, you're gonna know all of this stuff tomorrow. You're gonna have the notes so that you can look back at it when you need it and use it to your advantage. We talked a little bit about this, but some of the first questions we always get are, what are the B's again? Barolo versus Barbaresco versus Brunello. So we just talked about Barolo and Barbaresco, both focused on 100% Nebbiolo coming from Piedmont around the hills around the town of Alba. In Barolo, there's 5 main communes. If you like a really stern Barolo, you probably like the styles that come from the eastern side of the Barolo DOCG. A little bit of lighter style come from the western side, the commune there. Communes like Barolo and like Verduno coming from that area. Barbaresco is aged for a shorter amount of time. So you will get a little bit more fruit. The wine won't be as gracingly acidic and tannic on the palate as you might get from Barolo. Both wines tend to need to be aged, but it's kind of okay because you're never going to get a Barolo that's been aged for less than 38 months. That's how long it has to be aged for in order to say that it's Barolo and sell it for the amount of money that that name commands for a producer. Barbaresco, the minimum aging is 26 months. And they age these wines in barrels, but it's not usually new oak. And new oak will add, like think about Napa Cabernet, right? Vanilla, chocolate, sweet baking spice, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, allspice characteristic, a little toast and char to the wine that you put into a new oak barrel. But usually in Barolo and Barbaresco, not always, but usually this oak is more neutral, meaning it's been used so often that it no longer imparts those oak flavors to a wine. Think about if you take bourbon and you put it in a brand new oak barrel, which you have to call it bourbon, by the way, versus sometimes you get something that's just called whiskey, right? They don't call it bourbon. It's called American whiskey, maybe something like Mitchers. It doesn't have as much of that overt, like butterscotch, caramel, vanilla, sweet baking spice character as your bourbon, because it doesn't have to be aged in that brand new oak. Brunello, back to Tuscany. We're talking about that Brunello strain of Sangiovese. The longest aging requirement in Italy, it's 5 years altogether at the property before it's released, 2 years minimum in barrel, 4 years in bottle, but they can't release it until 5 years after the harvest. So again, if you like those kind of more tertiary earthy aromas and flavors, you're gonna look to Brunello. You're also gonna pay for that too. If you like Brunello and you don't want to spend $60, $100, $200 on your bottle of wine, you should look for something called Rosso di Montalcino, which is baby Brunello. It comes from the same area, the same vineyards, the same grape, but it's aged for a shorter amount of time, which is why they can't call it Brunello di Montalcino, but they call it Rosso di Montalcino, the red wine of Montalcino. So I guys went a little bit over, but we're pretty much done here. So we kind of learned about the culture and the style. We have these disparate regions and cultures and language, the climate, the terrain is all different. If you live in New York or anywhere in America and you have any friends that are Italian American, you know that there's an incredibly strong pride in the culture and the heritage, the love of food and wine, the traditions that we have around bringing people together to enjoy food and wine together are incredibly important. I worked harvest with an Italian winemaker in Oregon, and he would make me every day come at the same time to have a cup of coffee with him. We didn't have to talk to each other, but we had to at least do the activity together. You had to sit to eat together. You had to sit to have your coffee together. You had to go out to have a cigarette together. And then when you were done doing that, even if you didn't speak a word to each other, you could go in and you could finish your work. And as we mentioned before, what goes together grows together. And this is especially true in Italy itself. So we have 2 wines. I'm going to send these slides tomorrow. I'd love to hear if anyone has a comment about any of these wines. I'd love to hear them. So mine's been sitting here the whole time. I've been so chatty about Italy. I love talking about country, and I wish we had another hour to do a much deeper dive into these different regions. But we're talking about this Verdicchio coming from Castelli di Jesi. So we're in the Marche. Again, we're thinking we're just kind of south or just east where we might be in Tuscany, somewhere like Florence or Pisa. We're over to the east on the Adriatic Sea. I think these wines are fascinating. They have this kind of lemon lime character that you tend to get in a lot of these fresh white Italian wines, a little bit of salinity to it. And what I really love is this kind of like green almond tin characteristic. If you've ever had almonds before they're roasted, when they're still green, they're very cool. They're super yummy. Sometimes you see them in soups or on plates in Italy. They can be really lovely at this point as well. This is aged in stainless steel on what we call the lees, which is a little bit of that yeast after the fermentation that adds a little bit of texture to the wine as well. And what are you gonna have with this? So now you have wine. Most of us probably haven't had dinner yet. So what are you gonna make for dinner? Maybe you have some of these things at home, but if not, maybe you'll run out to the store or keep them in mind for next time. anything, we're on the coast here, right? In Castelli di Jesi. So any type of seafood, whitefish, mussels, oysters, pasta with pesto. These wines are really fantastic with salad with vinaigrette as well, because it can really stand up to the acidity that we get in a vinaigrette, which not all wines can. All right, now Manenti. So Cerasuolo di Vittoria. This is that DOCG coming from southern Sicily. Now, this has been a DOCG since 2005. So, wine law or these regions are constantly changing within Italy. This is a blend of Nero d'Avola with Frappato. The blend of Cerasuolo di Vittoria always has to be in the proportion of Nero d'Avola has to be between 50 to 70%, and the remaining percentage in the wine will be Frappato. Nero d'Avola tends to have a little bit more kind of dark fruit and peppery characteristic to it, where Frappato is kind of like Sicily's Gamay, kind of like their version of Beaujolais. The wines tend to be really kind of fresh. They have a lot of floral qualities to them. This is a red wine that you can drink on a hot island if you're having a drink of this. And think about these coastal areas that grow red grapes. You still want it to be refreshing when you have a glass. What can you have with this? I mean, this is a red wine that can actually go with seafood. We can talk about grilled sardines or grilled tuna, spicy pasta, tomatoes, anything with capers. Pizza would be really fantastic. You could think about octopus in red wine, or excuse me, in red tomato sauce would also be really incredible with this. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time, guys. Thank you for sticking around for a little bit later here. We had so much to cover. I really didn't even check out the chat box. Is there anything really pressing that I need to address in terms of questions?
Hey, Amber, this is Justin. I do have a question because when you're going through that Italian quality system, so right now I'm drinking a bottle of it's labeled DOCG, Reserva, Chianti 2016, and I spent $12 on this bottle.
Okay.
So I'm wondering what causes some bottles to be so much more expensive than others.
What is the region? What is the DOCG?
It is the region, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Campagna Giello, Pontedera, Italy.
Hold it up to the camera. Is it say Campagna?
Yeah.
Oh, I can't, unfortunately, I can't actually see it. Well, it could be. So a lot of it is the popularity. So, the areas that we know really well, Chianti, Brunello, Barolo, Barbaresco, they cost money because they're popular, right? Because the wines are popular, they tend to become more limited because they come from these smaller areas. And if you're coming really anywhere from the central Italy or north, the wines are almost always going to be more expensive. There's always exception to the rule. But if you're looking at one of those DOCGs that's in the southern part of the country where the infrastructure is much less, they really just can't sell their wines for that much. So some places like Puglia and Basilicata and Calabria or Molise, the wine can be a really fantastic quality and really great value too, because the producer just can't charge as much. I mean, if you walk into a wine store and you see, something from Puglia at $60 next to a bottle of Barolo at $60, you're going to get the Barolo, right? Because you're familiar with it. So that could be, it can be a lot of the reason.
Wow, that's interesting. So just going off that real quick, in your opinion, would you say price is more subjective than objective?
Well, one of the things I would like to say is, the market drives the price, right? So that could be subjective depending on what people get. The thing about Italian wine, the reason we learn about wine at all is to make better, more informed decisions as consumers that allow us to purchase better wine for less money. So that's kind of like the objective part, right? Now the subjective part is that the demand for the regions that are visible in the kind of American or the global market kind of drives the subjectiveness of the quality of these wines. Do you like the wine that you're drinking?
Absolutely. And
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So there we go. And then the other thing I say too is like, you know, this is a really difficult conversation because there's not actually a right answer for the reason of price. The more information you see on a label, usually the more expensive it will be. So that's why I explained at the beginning, like DOCG, then you also see Classico or Reserva or Superiore. They're telling you that the winemaker went extra. They did more, right? So that usually should mean that the wine is going to cost more. But then there's the idea of like, what's the difference between a good and a great wine? Yeah. Well, sometimes it's the story, right? Because can a wine ever be like truly great without the context? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? The idea of like, these people work these vineyards for this many generations. So I know that that's like a really wishy-washy and fluid answer, but I think it's like one of the best to sort of begin to understand the pricing concept of wine.
No, I think that's a great answer. I find it interesting too, because I was watching Netflix, they had a documentary on a guy that was forging wine labels, and he would buy these cheap wines and put on these labels that would shoot the price up by like 500% just because people are like, oh, it's so expensive, it must be good wine. Yep. So that's why I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great, he's talking about a documentary called Sour Grapes, which is really good. But it's true. It's you know, and a lot of people were fooled by him that purport to be some of the greatest palates for wine on earth. So what you really learn for that is, one, you should always drink what you like, regardless of the price, and you should always trust your palate over the price of a bottle of wine, right? Because sometimes you like the $15 bottle more than the $150 bottle. And there's a lot in Italy that's such an incredible place to explore for inexpensive wine. And one of the other things is like, I would feel comfortable spending $15 on a bottle of wine that I didn't end up liking, right? Mm-hmm. So you kind of, it gives you a little bit of financial freedom to explore whatever your cap is of like, I'm okay to spend 15 or 20 or maybe $25 to try this new bottle of wine. And at the very least, you probably won't love it, but it's not going to be undrinkable. So it's a really great area to explore for that reason.
For sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to send out the recording. If you guys want to take a look at that again tomorrow at any point, I'll also send out notes of the slides so that you don't have to remember everything we talked about tonight. But I really appreciate you coming tonight, spending this hour and 20 minutes with me. Thank you so much for sticking with us. And if you have any questions, you have my email. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll see everybody soon. Have a great night.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.